What's going on, everybody? Noah from Stage 3 Motorsports here, and today I'm going to be showing you how to install these Fox 2.0 coilovers and rear shocks on your Toyota Tacoma. Now, I do want to put a quick note in here to say that this truck has already been modified and we've done some work on it. So instead of showing you a removal that has a bunch of parts that don't look like factory parts on the truck, we're going to drop in the footage of doing the factory suspension removal so that way you guys can follow along. And then once everything's out, I'll hop back in with the new Fox equipment and show you how to bolt it up and work from there. But that should explain why it looks a little bit different once we get the Fox coilover in and why some of the parts that are on here were not on there in the beginning of the video. So with all that out of the way, let's get right into it. So to start disassembling our stock suspension, we're going to use a 10mm socket as well as a 12 to disconnect some of these brackets holding our brake lines and our ABS line. So we'll start up here and loosen this guy up. Now we're going to need a 12mm for the one down here on the knuckle. All right, and next up, we're going to want to remove this end link for our sway bar. So I'm going to take a 17mm to bust that free, and then we're going to work on actually getting this whole sway bar out of the way. There we go. As you'll see, as I go through, I typically like to put the nuts and bolts back in where I can, just so I don't forget where they go, and that way they don't get lost along the way. Now with this end link free, you'll want to go ahead and free up the one on the other side using a 17mm, just like we did here. And then I'm actually going to go underneath and use a 12mm socket on our ratchet to loosen up the bolts holding the skid plate on, and then that's going to give us access so we can get to the frame mount for the sway bar and move that all forward, and that just gives us a little bit more room to get the coilover out once we get to that stage. Using a 14mm socket on an extension, we're going to loosen up the two bolts holding this mount in now, and that's going to give us the ability to move this whole sway bar. Next, move on over to your tie rod end here, and we're going to use some pliers to just get this old cotter pin out of the way. With the cotter pin out of the way, grab a 19mm socket and a ratchet, preferably something a little bigger or something you can put a handle on to get some more leverage, and we're going to go ahead and loosen this up. There we go. Now as you back this up, I typically like to leave it on just with a couple threads to kind of guard this, because what we're going to need to do is hit the end of the knuckle to break this free. And a lot of times the Tacomas and the 4Runners have a tendency to really bind up here at these tie rod ends. So what also helps is adding a little bit of penetrating oil in there. Now I will caution you that if you're going to put some penetrating oil on it, don't spray it in there and leave it for an hour. I would let it sit a couple minutes and then give it a hit and see if you can get it free and wipe up any excess oil that's there. That way it's not going to seep down into your ball joints and just get all over the place or cause you issues with wearing these out prematurely. Now it is time to persuade it with a hammer. Cool. That worked like a charm to break it free, so we'll back this nut the rest of the way off. Now grab your pliers again, and we're going to pull this little cotter pin out of the nut that's securing the upper control arm into the knuckle. And this one kind of has like a little clip on the side that you have to pull to get it free, just like that. And this is going to be another 19mm to get it off.
All right, once again, at this point, I like to leave the nut on there just to hold this in place. And this is kind of an optional step. Normally you can come in and just hit the top of the knuckle to loosen this free and then pop it up, but there is quite a bit of tension on the upper control arm. So coming in here with some wrenches and loosening up the ends where the bushings are will take some of that tension away and just makes it a little safer and easier to move. So we're gonna do that first and then we'll get this all the way off. All right, now grab your 14mm socket, put it on the ratchet, and we're gonna loosen up the 3 nuts here holding on the top mount of the strut. Okay. Now, before we go ahead and try and remove this, we still need to undo the bottom. So all 3 of the top nuts are clear. We're gonna use a 19mm socket for this large nut on the back, and we'll just break this guy free, and then we should be able to pull the whole coilover out. All right, so you can see here we've got our new Fox coilover to go in, and obviously the truck looks a little bit different now. We have some aftermarket parts on here like I mentioned before, but generally the install process from here out is going to be pretty similar even if you don't have some of the parts that we do. We're going to start by using the hardware that Fox provides and putting a washer and a nut on all 3 of these studs on the top. And we'll just get them on here a little bit loosely, and then we can do the bottom mount and come back and tighten it once everything's attached. Now we're going to grab our ratchet and 19mm socket to tighten up the nut on this lower mount, and then you're going to torque everything back to factory spec. Moving back up to the top hat of the coil over here, we're going to grab our ratchet and a 17mm socket to tighten down these 3 nuts, and then at the end you'll torque them to factory spec. Now to bring your knuckle forward to meet the upper control arm here, we're going to push it in, and then you're going to want to grab on to where your wheel studs are or your brake rotor and kind of rotate slightly to turn the axle. So that way everything pushes in and the seats properly in the back. It usually won't seat all the way or it won't attach to the upper control arm if it's not connected right, but you definitely want to be certain that it is, or else you're going to have some serious issues with your 4-wheel drive. With the nut and washer on here loosely, that's going to keep our upper control arm and our knuckle attached. And before I tighten these, I'm going to add the tie rod end down here, get that locked in, so that way when we tighten this nut specifically, the whole knuckle isn't shifting around and I don't have to fight the play in the truck. Make sure you grab a brand new cotter pin for your castle nut here, and we'll push this through. With the tie rod locked in, we can come back and tighten the nut for our upper control arm.
At this point, you can go in and reattach your sway bar to the frame of the truck, as well as mounting the end links into the knuckle. But what I will say is make sure that you don't do this step until you have both of your new coilovers in, because the sway bar affects your ability to get the old coilover out and get the new one into place. But we're good on both sides, so now I can reattach it. It's worth noting that you might want to come back here to your upper control arm where it meets the frame and just tighten those mounts a little bit so they're somewhat snug, and then once the truck is sitting on the ground under its own weight, you can reach in here and finish locking those in. We're almost wrapped up in the front here. We just need to go back and reattach these brackets for our ABS and our brake lines. So the uninstall of the factory shocks on the back isn't too crazy, but you are going to need to use a 14mm wrench, and then typically I like to use a vice grip because this is a pin top style shock, so you need something to bite on to keep it from just rotating the shaft infinitely. So we'll get started on the top here by breaking this free. We'll take the little cap and the bushing off the top of this as well. And set those off to the side. All right, now we need to tackle the lower mount. Here you're gonna need to use a 17mm socket as well as a 17mm wrench. And we're just gonna loosen up this nut and bolt so we can pull that bolt through, and then that'll allow us to get this whole shock out. There we go. And make sure you save this lower hardware because you're going to be reusing it. You can grab your new Fox rear shock and remove the top bushing, but leave the bottom one in that washer on, and we'll kind of slide the post up through there. And then we can reapply the top bushing and washer. And we'll also thread the nut on here just loosely for now. Okay, and now that we still got some play, we can move and get our lower mount into place, and we'll come back and tighten that once it's locked in. Our lower mount is all locked in, so now we can come back up to the top, and we're gonna use a 19mm wrench here to turn this nut. If you can manage to work a socket on it, it's a little bit faster, but the inner fender here kind of blocks that out. So we'll just tighten this down, put a little bit of compression on those bushings, and we should be good to go. So that's going to be a wrap on this Fox suspension install, but one thing you guys want to make sure you do is once you have your truck assembled and the wheels and tires back on and the things on the ground, take it down to a shop, have a professional alignment done on it to get everything trued up, because this will affect the geometry of the front end and you're going to get weird tire wear if you don't get it properly aligned. So you definitely want to make sure you don't skip that step. With all that being said though, if you're watching this and you're interested in picking up one of these Fox suspensions for your truck, we'll have some links down in the description that you can check out that'll shoot you over to our website. And as always, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.